Hello, I am Peter Okwacha. Welcome to Focus on Africa, our top stories. The government of Lesotho's Prime Minister Thabane collapses in the wake of the scandal surrounding the killing of his estranged wife. What effect has the coronavirus had on conflict zones on the continent? We'll look at Libya and other regions where fighting continues.
Asking people to lock down and imposing a curfew with no real plan when they're being targeted puts people in danger.
African governments push for more concessions from lenders to help them deal with the pandemic. Also on the program, lessons in lockdown.
And play this side. Crossfader.
How the coronavirus is challenging parents to keep their children occupied. We meet Nairobi families finding imaginative solutions. Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Lesotho's coalition government, led by the embattled Prime Minister Thabane, has collapsed. 80-year-old Thabane has been under pressure to leave office for months now after he and his current wife were accused of orchestrating the murder of his estranged wife, Dipolelo Thabane, in 2017. A new Prime Minister must now be appointed. The BBC's Phumza Fihlani has been monitoring the story from Johannesburg. And Phumza, so the government has collapsed. Does this mean Mr. Thabane is no longer Prime Minister?
Well, officials there, Peter, say he is a figurehead at best. He is not a man who is in any position of power, really. And there are currently talks between the Lesotho Convention, Mr. Thomas Thabane's party, and a few of his former coalition partners to form a new government. They are expecting to wrap up these conversations in the next few days. Constitutionally, this means that currently there is no government in Lesotho, and the officials there have told me earlier today that they are keen to have one established as a matter of urgency. He has until the 22nd of May to step down, but the party, his own party, want him out by the end of the week if they have their way. They are keen to put an end to the Thabane years.
Now, Phumza, many believe that Mr. Thabane has spent the last few months trying to lobby those in power for immunity from prosecution. Is this going to be the case?
I mean, that's an important question, Peter. You'll remember that a few months ago when he was charged with the murder of his ex-wife, he tried a separate court process where his lawyers were arguing before the courts that it would create a constitutional crisis to charge a sitting prime minister. Doesn't seem that that is going to be a problem from now on. His party say they want him to stand trial and clear his name there. They've told me that they are not in any conversations with him about offering immunity. They believe that, like all citizens, he should stand trial and face the law and prove his case there.
Phumza, on social media, a lot of people have reacted to these events in that country with incredulity. What's been the reaction within the country itself?
It's been incredibly mixed, Peter. Some people feel that there should be some sort of arrangement made for the Prime Minister owing to his age. They don't want to see him being brought before the courts. They feel that there should be some sort of solution that the parties come to. But you also have a very large group of people in Lesotho who feel that Mr. Thabane, under his government, ruled with impunity, and that this very big question mark around what happened to his ex-wife needs to be answered, and that if he has nothing if he has done nothing, which is what he has said, then he should not he should not have a problem with being brought before the courts and prove his innocence there. They don't want to see him allowed to get away scot-free, as it were. They do feel that it's a serious enough crime that he needs to stand before the courts, him and his wife, his current wife, Messiah, and prove their case there.
Okay, Phumza, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much. Phumza Fihlani from neighbouring South Africa there. Thank you very much. Now, while the whole world is focused on tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, little attention is being given to people living in conflict-affected countries. The coronavirus outbreak has the potential not only to wreak havoc in already fragile states, but also trigger widespread unrest and severely test international crisis management. In March, the United Nations appealed for a ceasefire in all major conflicts around the world. Some groups heeded, others did not. Pierre-Antoine Denis gives us an overview of the situation in Africa.
Everything changed in a space of days after countries all across the world started imposing lockdowns at the end of March. It became clear that for some governments in Africa, fighting a pandemic would not be the only challenge they'll have to face, as there was a surge in terrorist attacks. In the Sahel, Boko Haram and its splinter group ISWAP organized strong and powerful attacks since the end of March. On one occasion, Chad suffered their biggest ever attack, losing 100 soldiers in one ambush on March 23rd. The following day, another ambush killed at least 50 Nigerian soldiers on the other side of the border. And the day later, in Mali, the opposition leader Soumaïla Cissé was taken hostage by members of armed groups close to the Islamic State. So 3 days of total chaos all across the region that created uncertainty and let armed groups gain ground, with regular attacks still ongoing. Now, let's cross to the other side of the continent, in Mozambique, where another group pledging allegiance to ISIS fully entered for the first time a major city in the Cabo Delgado region on March 23rd. Authorities there say the town has since been reclaimed by government forces. Still, this has not stopped Tanzania from sending troops to its border with Mozambique as a precautionary measure following a surge of violence all across the Cabo Delgado region.
Well, Libya is one country where COVID-19 has failed to stop the ongoing fighting. With world powers preoccupied with their own health crisis, the renegade General Khalifa Haftar is trying to consolidate power against the UN-recognized central government. There are currently 64 confirmed cases of coronavirus in Libya, and the country's healthcare system is already under pressure because of war. Rana Jawad has this report.
As the world battles outbreaks of COVID-19 at home and in their hospitals, Libya's primary front line is still a bitter war amongst its own men. These pro-government fighters on the fringes of the Libyan capital know of the threat of the virus, but to them, it isn't greater than the threat of the enemy they can see. For the government in Tripoli, the latest year-long battle against the renegade General Khalifa Haftar and his attacking forces peaked before COVID-19's curve. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister militarily dug in his heels, promising they would not give up their sovereignty or the land, nor reconcile with those who have demolished cities and people's homes. In late March, after suddenly losing much of the grounds his men gained around the capital in recent months, the renegade General Khalifa Haftar also addressed Libyans through his own media channels. He spoke of accepting what he claimed to be a mandate from the will of the people and indicated he was no longer willing to participate in UN-mediated political talks. Just as COVID-19 appeared in Libya a month ago, the conflict intensified, and so did its impact. Civilian casualties and internal displacement are now on the rise. And since January, a blockade on oil ports led by people loyal to East Libya's General Khalifa Haftar has cost the country billions in revenues. Ilham Saudi is the co-founder and director of the London-based human rights organization Lawyers for Justice in Libya. She believes that between war and COVID, the country and its people are in the midst of their worst-case scenario.
The response of the state has been ad hoc, has been non-systematic, and quite frankly, dangerous. Asking people to lock down and imposing a curfew with no real plan when they're being targeted puts people in danger. This pandemic has offered a cover for those who are seeking to consolidate power and to try to do that whilst the world is looking elsewhere and is not paying attention. And as a result, we've seen a massive escalation in casualties and a real suffering of the Libyan people.
Also caught between conflict and COVID-19 are refugees and migrants stuck in Libya with no legal rights to access any healthcare, and those still attempting the central Mediterranean crossing to a Europe whose ports are now largely closed. Libya's health sector has been weak for decades. It worsened over years of recent conflict, and with the looming potential of an uncontrolled COVID-19 spread, it could very quickly collapse entirely.
Libya already has a very overstretched health system, which is on the verge of collapse. On top of it, 15 hospitals have been directly hit in this conflict, some of which were actually designated as part of the response to the pandemic. Libyans must stop fighting now and must come together to combat the pandemic.
For Libyans still being repatriated home during the global pandemic, this weekend's attack on Tripoli's airport is a reminder on arrival that COVID-19 is not worse than the costly battles of this ongoing war. And for the country's fighting parties, the conflict for control is their top priority. Rana Jawad, BBC News.
All right, let's get more on this now. Dr. Hassan Kanenje is a security analyst with the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies and joins me from Nairobi. Dr. Kanenje, we'll talk about other conflicts on the continent in a moment. But first, is it surprising that even after the UN called for a global ceasefire, that fighting is still going on in Libya?
It's not surprising at all. Especially in Libya, because when you see what is happening is that the parties, or at least parties to the conflict, are trying to gain advantage and strengthen their hand at a potential later date when they have to negotiate. And so this, as the world gets distracted with COVID-19 and they become preoccupied with responding to it, I think conflictants or combatants in theaters of war, they are exploiting this as an opportunity to strengthen themselves, gain advantages that they're going to use at a later point. And we have seen conflict escalate, especially in Libya, largely because of that.
And across the continent as well, we've seen an upsurge in the Sahel region, in the Chad Basin and Mozambique just this weekend. Is it possible that resources that should be used in fighting COVID-19 are being diverted to fight these conflicts?
Well, ordinarily, you would expect that these resources should be diverted to fight COVID-19. But generally, in situations of conflict, especially in the continent, I think public health comes secondary to politics and war. And frankly, because of the long history of protracted conflict, I think parties are exploiting this to try and gain an advantage. And so public health becomes secondary. But this is going to cost the continent heavily in the years to come.
And what's the possibility of making all the sides in these conflicts realize that actually COVID-19 is an enemy that they should be fighting together, a common enemy which should be fought collectively?
I think the only way of making parties realize is to mobilize resources to bring to bear against them. Especially the international pressure. Now, unfortunately, right now, most countries internationally, they're focused on fighting COVID-19. However, if we start prioritizing security and stability of some of these countries, I think it's going to be helpful. And I think the international community has to be united to realize that while we are preoccupied with COVID-19, some of these countries and states may risk collapsing because of the insurgencies and the civil wars and, of course, extremist activities that are taking place in these countries.
And some heads of state have recently said that COVID-19 is probably a battle that will rage on for the rest of the year. Do you see these conflicts on the ground in places like Libya going on for that amount of time?
The conflict in Libya is likely to go on for some time, in part because there is no plan by a third party or international community that is solid enough to actually bring it to an end. And at a time when the international community is at its weakest point, in part because of the COVID-19, I think if attention is not paid, conflicts in places such as Libya, the Sahel region, and even the Horn of Africa is likely to get worse and might lead to catastrophic consequences, which, of course, we shouldn't allow to happen.
Okay, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, security analyst with the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you very much for your insight.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, one of the most powerful political figures in the Democratic Republic of Congo has appeared in court. Vital Kamerhe is accused of embezzling more than $50 million. He is President Felix Tshisekedi's chief of staff and was put in charge of a huge infrastructure program to mark his first 100 days in office. The trial will continue in 2 weeks. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Peter Okwoche. Still to come, the lessons of lockdown, how parents are learning to keep their children amused and educated while schools are closed. Welcome back to Focus on Africa. I am Peter Okwoche. In Ghana, President Akufo-Addo has extended the ban on public gatherings till the end of this month as the country's COVID-19 case count increases to 4,722 deaths. The ban was first imposed 2 months ago to curb the spread of the virus. Borders are also to remain shut till the end of May. Thomas Nadi has more.
In a televised address to the nation, President Akufo-Addo said that the 3-week extension was necessary to stop the spread of the virus. During this period, all religious activities, conferences and festivals are banned. On Thursday, Ghana's COVID-19 total case count increased sharply by nearly 30%, the highest in a single day. President Akufo-Addo explains.
It is important to stress that 533 out of the 921 new cases recorded between last Wednesday and Thursday are factory workers from a fish processing factory located in Tema. All 533 persons were infected by one person. Again, let me reiterate that these new 921 cases were from backlogs dating as far back as 26th April and not necessarily over a 24-hour window.
Ghana has now cleared the backlog of samples for testing in labs, which means that health authorities can now give daily updates as the infections occur. Over 160,000 samples have been tested so far, which is one of the highest mass testing rates on the continent. Thomas Nadi, BBC News, Accra.
Let's take a quick look now at other stories making the headlines across the rest of the world. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has defended his plan for easing the lockdown in England. The opposition said there was a lack of clarity after Mr. Johnson encouraged some people to return to work but avoid public transport. Scotland and Wales said it was too early to drop the message to stay at home. South Korea has postponed the reopening of schools as it announced its highest number of new cases of coronavirus in more than a month. It's also ordered all bars and clubs in the capital Seoul to close after dozens of new cases were traced back to one man's night out last weekend. As COVID-19 stretches the resources of many African governments, they are now asking international lenders to restructure their debts. China sits at the top of the list of individual lenders to Africa and faces pressure to give more concession during this time. Some countries have already raised money from the IMF and World Bank to fight off the adverse effects of the virus. BBC Africa business reporter Hudayfa Aden reports.
China has loaned African countries at least $143 billion in the last 2 decades, propelling Beijing to the top of the list of bilateral lenders to the continent, according to research firm Brookings Institute. Torn between honoring their debt obligations and setting money aside to contain the virus, African governments are walking a tightrope.
We've given a reprieve for up to December, which is welcome, but we will have wanted more. We will have wanted a space of about a year, if not 2 years. This is an ongoing discussion, but we are now asking for more. Kenya is not interested in debt write-off. At this stage, we are not, but we only wanted a breather to manage our fiscal space.
African finance ministers say in case they are exempted from servicing debts during this period, it could free up to $44 billion that could then be used to boost the vulnerable public health systems on the continent. Economist Stanislas Zeze, however, disagrees.
When you ask for extension and when you ask for freeze, you actually increase your risk profile negatively, obviously, which will have as a consequences for the countries to have limited access to funds in the future.
So far, 24 African countries have secured a total $9.5 billion in emergency financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund to help them allocate more resources to safeguard public health, support households and businesses against the adverse economic effects of COVID-19. Kenya and Uganda are the latest countries to get the funding. The World Health Organization has announced a new projection for COVID-19 cases in Africa. Up to 190,000 people could die if the outbreak is not controlled. That is a reality that awaits decision makers and authorities if something is not done fast enough. Hudayfa Aden, BBC, Nairobi.
Now, the shutdown of schools amidst the COVID-19 pandemic has come up with a huge challenge for most parents: how to keep their children at home while ensuring learning and playing continues. On social media, parents have aired their frustrations and shared tips on coping. Mercy Juma looks at how people in Nairobi are responding.
1, 2, go!
For children all over, their world has been turned upside down. No school, no visits, no playground. Many parents admit it is a struggle to keep them entertained and at least keep their routines as close to normal as possible. In this estate in Kiambu, Kenya, a community effort has been employed to at least offer some sense of normalcy. Twice a week, everyone opens their balconies and steps out for a Sunday school service. They call it the balcony-to-balcony service.
The service is really helping. The children are more confident. They are less fearful. Sometimes they fight because they have nothing to do. But now I have seen they usually get the positive side of it, that they can have somebody come and preach to them in their houses.
A simple gesture while keeping all the rules of social distancing, but one that has brought smiles, a sense of hope, and lessened anxiety to the dozens of children in this estate and their parents too.
Crossfader and play this side. Crossfader.
Where community approaches are not feasible, individual parents like Jackson Kamau, a professional DJ, take it upon themselves to teach their young ones some skills.
Right now you have to be a teacher. You are a parent and you also have to be a teacher. You need to take time and just go through things that your child has learned in class over the term. You need to learn that teachers need to be patient, and so if you're a parent out there and you're not as patient, you need to learn patience. Learning new things is what we are doing.
Many parents confess it has been hard to help their children to adjust to their new restrictive environment and dealing with the unavoidable task of keeping young ones active but safe.
Speak honestly with them without creating fear or discomfort. Create play around such things. Yes, how do you use play, for instance? That's critical. Use it to build new skills. If a younger child is impatient, for example, help them sit still by giving them a pen or pencil and paper and ask them to draw their favorite character on a program they like. One can alternate this by creating a play area inside the house.
Keely reminds us that kids are going to have memories of this time. You want to try to make it a positive and rewarding experience for them as much as possible. Mercy Juma, BBC News.
Believe me, I've got tales to tell. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Don't forget, you can get in touch with me and some of the team on social media. I'm at Okwoche. But from me, Peter Okwoche, that's it from Focus on Africa for today. See you again very soon. Goodbye.